Hello, I'm Michael Dwyer, and welcome to a new episode of Historically Speaking. My topic today is civil stories from Civil War pensions. A little bit of background. We all know that the Civil War made a searing imprint across American history. And throughout Vermont, we have many monuments to fallen Civil War soldiers. And there are many people who participate in battle reenactments. We have a wonderful Remembering the Civil War page. It's vermontcivilwar.org. Many people are true experts in the Civil War. I would not consider myself to be an expert by any means, but I do know something from my own research about people whose lives were forever changed by the Civil War. Beginning in 1862, the United States government issued a pension system. And by the time that the last pension file was closed, and it really isn't closed, as I'll say in a moment, there were close to 1 million people by the turn of the 20th century that collected Civil War pensions. From my own collection, I'd like to share with you some of the stories about the lives that I learned about and were affected by the war. The story begins with how my interest in the Civil War became much more personal. In my first slide here, this is a picture taken on Columbus Day weekend 1975 in Westminster, Vermont. I met my grandfather, Emery Morse, for the first time. It's a long and involved story beyond our scope, why I was so long in meeting my grandfather for the first time. As I came to know him, I discovered that he was a true Civil War buff. My grandfather was born in 1907, and he lived during his childhood with his grandfather, who was a Civil War veteran. Here we have Anthony Pierce on the right-hand side of the photograph, his wife Helen, and his 11th and 12th child. The little girl whom you see here is my grandfather's mother, Myrta Pierce Morse. Anthony was an object of fascination for the children in the neighborhood, because you may notice here how he is turned in a slightly odd way away from the camera. And that is because he had his arm amputated. And as my grandfather related the story to me, and this is a very nice studio picture of his grandfather, Anthony Pierce lost his arm during the Civil War when he fought at the Battle of Gettysburg. This is an entirely plausible story, except from his Civil War record, I know that he re-enlisted after Gettysburg. So it seemed unlikely that he would have re-enlisted if he had lost his arm. The other fascinating part of the story is that Anthony Pierce had a first cousin who lived next door. And they enlisted from Wareham, Massachusetts at the same time. So here we have a great Civil War photograph of Anthony and his first cousin, Nehemiah Davis. They look like brothers. Their mothers were sisters. And in another strange twist of fate, their children married each other. So we had relatives that were double second cousins. Nehemiah Davis lived well into my grandfather's lifetime, so he had the opportunity to listen to Nehemiah's stories as well. So with the possibility of Anthony's Civil War pension, I wanted to determine, was he truly wounded at Gettysburg? Did he lose his arm during the Civil War? I also had an alternative story handed down from another cousin that said that Anthony's arm was gradually amputated, beginning from the wrist, then at the elbow, to prevent the spread of cancer. Which story was true? So in 1985, when I began my quest to obtain a Civil War pension file from the National Archives in Washington, there was no internet at that time, and you would write to the National Archives, and there was a form that was filled out in triplicate, and here is my copy from 1985. And if you notice here that the cost is $5 for the file. What I received was not the complete Civil War file, but only a portion of it. And our friend Bill Powers, if you're listening, I have taken your advice to heart many times since then. Even though it costs more to obtain the complete pension file, it is well worth the investment. I did find, not in this shortened version of the pension file, but I did find out eventually that yes, Anthony Pierce had a slight wound at Gettysburg. He re-enlisted, and it wasn't until 25 years after the Civil War that he had a series of operations at the Massachusetts General Hospital to have his arm amputated, which was successful in prolonging his life because he lived to the age of 77. Anthony Pierce and his wife had 12 children. Remarkably, these children born between 1864 and 1888 all lived to maturity. But another thing that I wanted to establish was a very odd family story that the eldest son ran away to Pennsylvania, eloped with a young girl from the church choir, and it was obvious that they could not stay together, breaking the law. So they ran off into the woods, and it was a murder-suicide pact. Quite a story. And I thought, well, how am I going to prove any of this? And I had absolutely no idea when Arthur, the eldest son, died. So in the pension file here, since Anthony needed to prove that he had children dependent on him, in this declaration from 1898, he lists his living children. Arthur was not among them. So eventually, I found my way to the lurid story of Arthur, who eloped with a girl just like the story said, and it was splashed all over the newspapers. And I could not have narrowed down the date without looking into the Civil War pension file. Moving closer to Rutland, Vermont, we have the story of James Tree of Rutland, whose real name was Tremaine. And James Tree, as a young man, fought in the Vermont 7th, and beginning in the 1880s, he tried unsuccessfully to obtain a Civil War pension. After his death, his widow Nora, who at that point still had young children to support, sent this letter in which she listed the baptisms of their children, dates of birth, etc., and she pleaded to obtain a pension. She did get one eventually, but the problem with James's initial pension is that he said that he contracted malaria during the Civil War, and the medical examination for the pension said that there was no connection to his later physical afflictions and whether or not he contracted malaria during the Civil War. And eventually, Nora, who lived until 1911, was able to collect a Civil War pension based on the need of her to support her children. We also have people that, shall we say, fabricate the story. So we have a woman in Burlington who was named Rosella Limoges, and it's really Limoges in French. And she said that she was the mother of a man named Edward Chiat, who was born in Burlington, served in the Civil War, etc. And since her son was her sole support, she wanted to obtain the pension based on his service. And this led me to look for Edward Chiat's Civil War application for a pension. One of the problems with this pension that sent alarm bells off to me is that Edward Chiat and Edward Ryan were the same person. So among the hundreds of thousands of Civil War pensions, when you see someone that has an alias, it's certainly worth investigating, because why would someone change their name? Many French names, as we've said on previous programs, may have been garbled, they may have been anglicized, but how do we get from Ryan to Chiat and vice versa? So in this application, he claims all these various disabilities. He contracted rheumatism, he had a hernia from his service in the Civil War. But the deeper that I dug into his pension file, which was turned down, we have the hospital ticket by which he was admitted, and very clearly you can see that his name, as Edward Ryan, he was afflicted with gonorrhea, not exactly malaria. So once again, he was turned down and his mother was turned down, that whatever her son's affliction was, it wasn't a Civil War disability. This is more about the testimony of the rather disturbing account of Edward Ryan, Edward Chiat's extracurricular activities during the Civil War. One of the things that we sometimes forget is that the Civil War pension system also provided for parents during the Civil War, in this instance when the need was genuine. And in the pension file of Silas Campbell, who died in Florida in 1864, we have an actual letter that his father sent to the pension office. And reading the transcription here, it reads, have got paid off and have sent home by tele $50 and shall send the rest of it as soon as we get paid off again. For we did not get but 79 this time, and I will send 19 next time, as that will make up the $200 in all. And he signed his name Silas Campbell. Silas's father, after the war, citing the need that his son was his sole support, did obtain the pension. In another instance, Lucius Leach, who fought in the Vermont 19th Infantry, he started to apply for a pension in 1866. And sometimes the process of getting physicians' examining certificates, the extent to which one was disabled, sometimes veterans died before their actual pension was approved. As I was looking into the life story of Lucius Leach, I was delighted to find on our Vermont in the Civil War page, which not only has enlistment information about soldiers, but sometimes there are people who contribute photographs. So here we have a carte de visite photograph of Lucius that was taken in 1864. After Lucius's death, his mother applied successfully for a pension. You can see here is Lucius's initial document to apply for a pension. And then we have his mother, Elizabeth Leach, in 1871, giving all the details of information. And what is remarkable about this is that Lucius's parents did not have their marriage recorded in Vermont records. Lucius's mother did not have a birth date. And you can see in this application for the mother's pension, it has her date of birth, the date of the marriage, and documentation for all the other children. So these are the wonderful types of finds that you can find within complete pension records. The Civil War pension system also provided for orphan children. One person that I am continuing to investigate is a man who died in Plattsburgh in 1862. He died in boot camp. His name was Alexander Mercury. It's really Mercure. He was born to parents from French Canada. His wife was granted a pension shortly after his death, but when she, Sophronia, the wife, died in 1867, they left behind 3 children. And those 3 children, Sophronia, Alexander, and Louisa, listed here with their dates of birth, they were given $8 a month to an uncle who acted as their guardian. The dates that we see here for the births of these children were the only actual record of their birth. We can see then the expansiveness of this pension system, not only taking care of veterans, but also their parents, and in this instance, orphan children. By a curious twist of fate, Louisa, the orphaned daughter of Alexander Mercury, married a very peripatetic man named George Smith. George Smith appears from nowhere when he marries Louisa in 1888 in Waterbury, Vermont. They have 6 children in the next 8 years. Louisa, the Civil War orphan, herself dies in 1900 at the age of 39, and her children are placed in the orphanage. But we have, through one of her children's descendants, this Civil War photograph. And I discovered that the man that Louisa married did apply for a Civil War pension. He was considerably older than Louisa. But this man, George Smith, seems to have fabricated his Civil War record. He claimed to have served all 4 years. He said that he was wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg. And what happened is the actual documentation showed that he did not join a regiment until after Gettysburg, and allegedly he deserted in May of 1865 after the war is over. But just yesterday, in pondering this story, which I've been investigating for 25 years, I think that this Civil War hand-tinted image is not of George, the man with the shady past, but I actually think that this is of Alexander, the Civil War soldier, whose image would have been preserved by his orphan children. Now, of course, there's no one living or really living in the past century that could tell me if this is true or not, but I will try to build a case by which I could evaluate the provenance of this photograph. There were many veterans who simply didn't qualify for their disability pension. So here we have a great-great-great-grand-uncle, Lewis Nathaniel Hall of Block Island, Rhode Island. And he injured his ankle pretty severely, was sent home, actually spent time in Hospital Bay, and during the 1880s, he began the arduous process of trying to apply for a Civil War pension. He was turned down every time, but he married as his second wife, a much younger woman, in 1870, and he proceeded to have children with Effie, wife number 2, between 1881 and 1888. So when he died in 1895, he still had a house full of children, His widow had a house full of children, so she was able to collect the Civil War widow's pension. And of course, over time, the qualification for obtaining pensions broadened to include widows and children. The best documentation that I have is the last Civil War widow died last year in 2020. As remarkable as that sounds, a woman married and a 70-year-old man around 1920, and this veteran at the age of 80 is alleged to have sired a child. And right now, although their identities do not want to be known, there is supposedly at least 1 or 2 people who are collecting pensions, albeit small, as children of Civil War veterans. Lewis Nathaniel Hall's brother, John Thomas, brother-in-law, also fought in the Civil War from Block Island. And here he is later in his life. And when John Thomas died in 1922, he had the distinction of being the last surviving person in his regiment. But here is the strange thing about his entire pension file. He was a builder and stonemason. He began applying for his pension in the early 1890s, citing all the reasons that he could not work. But in 1922, at the age of 88, he was working on his daughter's roof, and he fell off, and it was from those injuries from which he died. Another person connected with his family, and oh, what a story this is, George A. Payne. George A. Payne was the nephew of the previous 2 men from Block Island. And he actually admitted himself at the age of 55 to the Soldiers' Home in Bristol, Rhode Island, claiming that his wife abandoned him. And he actually discharged himself from the Soldiers' Home, took the ferry across Narragansett Bay to Fall River, Massachusetts, walked into the hospital, and died. I used to walk by his grave on my way home from school, never knowing that I had a relative who died in the Civil War. But his estranged wife, whose marriage was never legally dissolved, went through an elaborate process to continue collecting his pension. And you may be able to see at the bottom of his pension card are the letters XC. Whenever you see XC in a pension file, it means that this was an ongoing file through the 1930s and 40s. And when I first wrote to Washington, D.C., 30-some years ago to obtain this pension, they told me that it was not in the National Archives, and I actually had to go over to the Veterans Administration in White River Junction, where I could actually not take any pictures of the pension, but actually take notes from it. And there are a number of pensions, and I may get to another one, that are only on file at the Veterans Office in White River Junction because of people who collected as widows well into the late 1940s. In another very interesting case, we have Rufus Hamilton. Rufus Hamilton was born in Montgomery, Vermont. He was an alumnus of Castleton Medical College, but early in his married life, he moved to Dunham, Quebec. Nonetheless, he served in a New York regiment as a surgeon. In 1881, he was on a train ride not far from his home in Dunham, and he heard that there was a little girl who was quite ill. As he was moving from one carriage to another, the train went around a bend, he lost his balance, fell from the train and died. It took his widow 12 years to obtain a pension because she was living in Canada. Why was this man living in Canada involved in the Civil War? So it took a great deal of documentation within this file to prove that this woman was entitled to a pension. And in the last story that I would like to tell, you wouldn't think that this picture had anything to do with the Civil War. But the young lady here is my dad's cousin Naomi, who was born in 1918. She lived to the age of 96. And she always lived with her mother's aunt here. This aunt claimed that she had an uncle who fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War, and he changed his name. And this was just a very unlikely family saga. So what I was able to prove is that, yes, there was a man in the family. His real name was John Thomas Kennedy, but for reasons uncompletely known to me, I think he got into trouble in New York City in the 1850s with the Fenian organization. So when he enlisted in the United States Army prior to the Civil War, he adopted an alias. And that is very clear here that after the Civil War, long after the Civil War, his second wife obtained his pension and proved that the man who was John Kennedy really was John Walsh. And to show you that these files often have family drama within them, the soldier's daughter, Jane, wrote a letter to the pension board that the father's second wife was actually a gold digger and should not get the pension. And she writes in this letter, "I think it would be a miscarriage of justice if this woman is granted a pension as her financial condition does not warrant it," etc., etc. And among the ongoing pension investigations that I am still involved in is that of Patrick McMahon. Patrick McMahon, who was in the 13th Vermont Regiment, died in 1915. He leaves many descendants in this area. He was the subject of a very nice obituary in the Rutland Herald in 1915, which claims that he is the last of the 13th Regiment. His wife, Fanny King, really family Leroy, dies in 1943. One of the problems that I haven't quite figured out is that Fanny was married to another man before she met Patrick McMahon. Fanny's marriage to Patrick McMahon has never been solved, but what I have to do is go to White River or wherever that pension is being stored, because since it was active until 1943, it still has not been digitized. And as of our taping this morning, the National Archives is only open on a very, very limited basis because of COVID, and people who are applying for pensions may have to wait a very long time. Once again, it was my pleasure to share with you some of these stories. Thank you for watching.